Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a systems-level deep dive into what is, I think, one of the most definitive critiques of global authority structures from the modern era.
We're talking about Noam Chomsky's 2016 collection of essays, Who Rules the World?
And that title, it's designed to be provocative, of course.
Right. But the book immediately goes beyond that simple sort of high school civics view of state power. The idea that global policy is just what a few presidents and prime ministers decide.
Exactly. Chomsky insists that the core question isn't just who is in the halls of government making policy, but really, for whom is that policy being made?
So it's about the forces behind the decisions.
It is. He argues that we have to focus on the confluence of state decisions, the visible actions of political actors, and the pervasive influence of elite economic and financial interests that really shape those choices and, set the entire menu of what's even possible.
So we're looking at the institutional architecture, not just the individual architects. And why is understanding this so urgent right now?
Because these entrenched global power structures, they set the terms for almost everything. They determine the entire global discourse.
On everything from immediate conflicts.
Right, like the power dynamics in Israel-Palestine or the mechanics of the war on terror, all the way up to the ultimate existential issues of survival for the human species.
And when you say existential issues, we mean the two huge dangers that are always sort of looming in the background: the growing risks of nuclear war and the accelerating pace of environmental destruction.
The stakes couldn't be higher.
So this deep dive is really a mission to understand the machinery of power itself.
It is, and our focus here is impartial. It's strictly analytic. We're aiming to examine the structural incentives and the narrative frameworks that consistently reinforce the outcomes we see.
We're here to understand why these systems, which are driven by certain institutional imperatives, consistently produce these specific and often destructive outcomes.
Exactly. It's not about assigning blame to individuals or to specific political parties. The question we're asking is, what is the logic of the system itself?
Okay, so before we dive into the mechanics of all that, we should probably situate the author and the work itself. For anyone who might not be familiar with his broader work, Noam Chomsky is, well, he's arguably one of the world's greatest living public intellectuals.
And he's certainly one of the most prominent. He started out, as a pioneering figure in modern linguistics. That's where he first made his name.
But his influence goes so much further than language.
Oh, absolutely. For decades, he has been this relentless, incredibly meticulous critic of U.S. foreign policy, of concentrated power, and of the ideological systems that, justify and conceal how these things operate.
His whole career has basically been dedicated to synthesizing historical archives, public records, academic research, all to reveal these patterns of systemic failure and elite decision-making.
And this book, Who Rules the World, is really a continuation of that. It's a culmination of this lifelong analysis, and it builds on his earlier major works, especially Hegemony or Survival.
So what was the specific purpose behind compiling this particular collection of essays?
It really seeks to explore the exact question in the title. Who rules the world? How do they do it? And maybe most importantly, where are those actions leading us?
And the timing is important here, too. It was compiled and published around 2016.
Yes, a period that was really marked by this widely felt global anxiety. There was a sense of instability, this perception of U.S. decline after the 2008 financial crisis, and just increasing geopolitical tensions everywhere.
So it's responding to this context of the U.S. operating as the, quote, first among unequals since World War II. It's a power that has largely set the terms for global discourse, for international institutions, even as its relative power has, diminished in some ways since its absolute peak after 1945.
That's a really crucial distinction to make. The power might be diminishing in relative terms, but the structural legacy and the doctrine, they remain firmly in place.
And Chomsky notes this decline isn't just an American thing.
No, it's shared within what he calls the de facto world government. And this, for him, is the real ruling structure that operates, beyond the framework of any national democracy.
So who makes up this de facto world government? Who's actually in this global ruling class?
Well, it consists of the leading state capitalist powers, so primarily the G7 countries, and then all the vast international institutions they control.
The IMF, the World Bank, Global Trade Organization.
Exactly. And the business press, sometimes they'll refer to the key players in this financial and corporate elite as the masters of the universe.
Right.
And while the U.S. plays the leading role here, setting the agenda, the geopolitical framework, The real power is shared. It's exercised through these interconnected global institutions that operate almost entirely outside of democratic oversight.
So if the U.S. is kind of the head of the global political state, who's the real power behind the throne? To put Chomsky's central thesis in the plainest language possible, who are the primary actors ruling the world?
The primary actors, according to his thesis, are the masters of mankind.
Which is a powerful term.
It is, and he very consciously borrowed it from the 18th century economist Adam Smith from his critique of mercantilism. These aren't state actors in the traditional sense. They are the corporate and financial elites and the state structures that are basically designed to serve their interests.
And that immediately puts this in a historical context. I mean, Smith wasn't talking about modern hedge funds. He was talking about the monopolistic merchants and manufacturers of his own time.
Precisely. And Smith, who we often celebrate as the founder of modern capitalism, was actually fiercely critical of the concentrated power he saw. He defined the motivation of these elites by what he called their vile maxim.
All for ourselves and nothing for other people.
That's the one. And Chomsky argues that this relentless pursuit of maximal self-interest, this vile maxim, is what drives current global policies. Policies that consistently work against the interests of, well, the underlying populations, global justice, and any kind of long-term stability.
So the central thesis here is that global outcomes, whether we're talking about military interventions or domestic economic policy, they're best understood not as accidental failures or mistakes,
Oh, not all.
but as the consistent, rational outcomes of a system that is designed to fulfill the vile maxim of the masters of mankind.
All right, let's dig into that system. Let's start by looking inward at the core mechanism of power within societies that we call democratic, the systematic exclusion of the majority.
And this isn't just, a political philosophy critique. Chomsky anchors this section in some very concrete, extensive U.S. political science research.
He cites work from Martin Gellens and Benjamin Page in particular. Yes, and their work provides some really compelling empirical evidence. I mean, they analyzed thousands of policy outcomes, and they concluded that, and I'm quoting here, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy.
Which, crucially, is the exact opposite of the idealized version of American governance we're often told.
It directly contradicts theories like majoritarian electoral democracy, the idea that policy reflects what the average citizen wants.
Right.
Instead, their findings strongly supported what they called economic elite domination and biased pluralism. And the implication of that is, well, it's devastating. It means the large majority of the population, especially people at the lower end of the income and wealth scale, are effectively excluded from the political system.
Their opinions are statistically insignificant.
Exactly. They don't determine policy choices. And this is where the mechanism of power really shows itself. One of the most cynical findings he cites is that a remarkably good predictor of what policy will actually pass is campaign funding.
So forget public polls and town halls. Just follow the money.
That's the argument. The policies that the public overwhelmingly favors, things like minimum wage increases, comprehensive health care, they are consistently blocked if they run counter to the interests of the concentrated wealth that's needed to fund campaigns.
And this systemic exclusion often leads to what gets mislabeled as voter apathy.
Well, of course. Why would you participate or even follow politics when the structure itself is designed to ignore your voice?
And Chomsky is quick to point out that this isn't some uniquely American problem. The same dynamic financial power overriding popular will played out very dramatically in Europe.
Oh, absolutely. The Greek debt crisis is probably the most vivid example.
Right.
You saw decision-making on these crucial fiscal and economic issues shift dramatically from elected national bodies to the centralized Brussels bureaucracy and, more importantly, to the financial powers that control it. The entire institutional structure of the EU is, in a sense, designed to minimize popular input and maximize the influence of finance.
And the political elite's contempt for democracy was just laid bare in 2015 with what he calls the savage reaction to the Greek population trying to determine its own future.
The Greek people voted overwhelmingly to reject the draconian austerity measures being proposed.
And the response from the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF was immediate and brutal.
They imposed even harsher austerity policies. I mean, the very idea of the people of Greece determining their own fate was met with what amounted to a declaration of financial war.
And what was the stated goal of that austerity versus what actually happened?
Well, the policies were supposedly aimed at reducing Greek debt. But, as Chomsky notes, the austerity measures actually increased the debt relative to GDP.
While shredding their social fabric.
Absolutely. Mass unemployment, immense suffering. The ultimate unstated goal wasn't to save Greece. It was to bail out the major French and German banks that had made these incredibly risky, ill-advised loans in the first place.
So Greece just became a funnel.
A funnel to transfer the costs of those banking errors from concentrated financial interests onto the European tax bench and the suffering Greek populace. It's a pristine example of the masters of mankind overriding democratic will for their own self-preservation.
Okay, so let's shift our gaze from that domestic exclusion to global control. Chomsky meticulously lays out the foundational U.S. strategic planning since World War II, which was built on maintaining control over what the planners called the Grand Area.
The Grand Area. This was conceived during World War II as this vast, strategically crucial zone that the U.S. intended to organize and control after the war.
And it spanned the globe, but it had a special focus.
A critical focus on the Middle East North Africa region, or MENA. State Department planners in the 1940s were incredibly explicit in their documents. They described MENA as a stupendous source of strategic power and probably the richest economic prize in the world.
So the goal from day one was to ensure control over those resources. But Chomsky argues the concern has always been deeper than just access to oil.
It's fundamentally about control. As one influential advisor, Adolf Berle, articulated back then, control of the Middle East's incomparable energy reserves would yield substantial control of the world.
Yeah, the strategic logic follows from that.
It does. If the U.S. loses control of that region, its global dominance is threatened. And that is the logic that drives perpetual intervention.
And this original strategic objective, it just gets repackaged in modern foreign policy, which brings us to the Clinton Doctrine.
Right. The Clinton Doctrine, which came about in the 1990s, explicitly declared the U.S. right to use military force unilaterally to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources.
Which requires a massive military footprint.
Huge military forces forward deployed all over the globe, not necessarily for defense, but in order to shape people's opinions about us, which is a euphemism for deterring dissent, and to shape events that will affect our livelihood and our security. It's the official statement of the imperial doctrine.
But the doctrine isn't just about resources. It's maybe even more about stamping out any sign of independent development that might inspire others to leave this grand area system.
This is what he calls the virus of independent nationalism. Henry Kissinger famously framed independent, self-determined movements like the democratically elected Salvador Allende government in Chile in the early 70s as a virus that might spread contagion.
The fear wasn't Chile itself, but the example it might set.
Exactly. The fear was that if Chile could successfully pursue independent socialist development, then other, more resource-rich nations might decide to follow suit.
So the destruction of Allende's government, which led to the 1973 coup, wasn't about a threat to U.S. security. It was about internal control over the system.
Absolutely. The goal of the U.S.-backed overthrow of Allende was explicitly to kill this virus, to demonstrate that if the United States couldn't maintain control over Latin America, it couldn't expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world.
So destroying that movement was necessary to maintain global dominance.
And in Kissinger's famous term, U.S. credibility, that one word, credibility, tells you everything you need to know about what kind of behavior is acceptable within this global system. It's about the enforcement of submission.
This doctrine of control, it needs a lot of ideological justification. And that brings us to Chomsky's really powerful critique of how human rights and violence are selectively perceived. He starts by delineating two categories of intellectuals.
Yes. On one side, you have the responsible intellectuals. They're technocratic, policy-oriented, and they serve the state, making sure the prevailing narrative stays on course.
And they're rewarded for it.
With positions of influence, with prestige. Then on the other side, you have the eccentric or value-oriented intellectuals, the dissidents. The ones who dare to challenge authority, to question official war aims, to apply universal moral principles.
And the historical pattern he outlines is just remarkably consistent. The conformist is honored, while the dissident, the one who applies moral principles to their own government's actions, is often punished, denounced, or silenced.
And this ideological filter, it allows for what he calls selective outrage.
Right.
So violence committed by our enemies, an act of terrorism by an adversary, like the Achille Lauro hijacking in 1985, is met with absolute moral horror. It generates extensive, sustained media coverage, political condemnation, even movies.
But comparable, or even vastly more severe, terrorism committed by the U.S. or its allies is just. It's conveniently ignored. It's disappeared from historical memory.
Think about that Achille Lauro hijacking. It's often held up as this benchmark of enemy terrorism. Chomsky points out this was retaliation for the Israeli bombing of Tunis just a week earlier, ordered by Shimon Peres, which killed 75 Tunisians and Palestinians.
And Washington cooperated by not warning Tunisia.
And Secretary of State George Shultz actually called the bombing a legitimate response to terrorist attacks.
So a large-scale state bombing that kills 75 people is legitimate. But the hijacking that followed is an outrage. But that's not even the worst example from that year he provides.
No. Even more severe was the Beirut car bombing that same year, timed for Friday prayers outside a mosque. It killed 80 people and wounded 256, mostly girls and women.
And that attack was carried out by the CIA.
With Saudi allies, and specifically authorized by CIA Director William Casey, according to Bob Woodward's reporting. This kind of extensive U.S.-backed terrorism, far deadlier than the hijacking, is simply not considered terrorism in mainstream discourse. It's forgotten, it's uninvestigated, and it's unpunished.
Which brings us to a really crucial point about how we interpret history, the concept of the first 9/11.
It's an incredibly powerful piece of analysis. Chomsky contrasts the world-changing perception of 9/11/2001, which was, rightly condemned as an outrage, with the first 9/11.
September 11, 1973, the U.S.-backed military coup in Chile.
Exactly. That coup overthrew the democratically elected Salvador Allende, and it led to mass murder, systematic torture, and economic devastation that far exceeded the U.S. per capita equivalent of the 2001 attack.
And yet, when the coup happened, Henry Kissinger assured President Nixon it was nothing of very great consequence.
The fundamental distinction, then, it seems to be the moral calculus that's applied to the victims of the crime. We're allowed to disregard the victims if the perpetrator's intent is defined in a way that minimizes their moral responsibility.
This is the core ideological trick. The common defense for U.S. or allied violence is that it involves accidental killing, while our adversaries purposely kill civilians.
But Chomsky introduces a third and I think more accurate category for many of these atrocities: murder with foreknowledge but without specific intent.
Let's unpack that because it's a terrifyingly cynical concept. What does that mean in practice?
It means that the perpetrators know with a very high degree of certainty that their actions will result in mass death, but they avoid the specific legal term intent.
Give us an example.
Consider the U.S. missile attack on Sudan's Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in 1998, ordered by Bill Clinton. Human Rights Watch informed Clinton that this single plant supplied 90% of Sudan's essential pharmaceuticals. Clinton knew the bombing would lead to a humanitarian catastrophe,
Resulting in tens of thousands of deaths.
from preventable diseases, lack of medicine. But because the missile wasn't aimed at a specific person or a specific hospital, the state avoids moral culpability for mass murder.
The victims in this framework are just regarded like ants we crush while walking down a street.
They're what George Orwell called unpeople. The decision makers didn't specifically intend to murder the particular children who would die of malaria because the medicine supply was destroyed, but they had foreknowledge that those deaths were an inevitable consequence. The victims are simply not deemed worthy of the moral consideration that specific intent would imply.
So if the masters of mankind relentlessly pursue this vile maxim, the ultimate consequence is this structural inability to deal with the gravest existential threats. Chomsky argues the system just prioritizes short-term profit and power over long-term survival.
And he focuses on two overwhelming dangers: nuclear war and climate catastrophe.
On nuclear war, the situation isn't just dangerous, it's getting worse.
It is. Experts like former Defense Secretary William Perry, who is a highly inflamed specialist, warn that the probability of a nuclear calamity is actually higher today than during the Cold War.
And that assessment comes from a mix of deteriorating technology, political instability, and new policies.
Critically, dangerous new policies. The U.S. is actively pursuing what he calls national insecurity through a massive modernization program.
We're talking about a planned, Trillion-dollar enhancement of nuclear weapon systems.
Correct. And this includes developing new nuclear cruise missiles with improved targeting and, crucially, lower yields.
Why are lower yields so dangerous?
Because specialists warn they're incredibly dangerous. They might encourage policymakers to believe that a limited nuclear war is feasible or survivable or even winnable, and that just lowers the barrier to first use.
That structural incentive for escalation is truly terrifying. If leaders start thinking they can use a nuke without immediate mutual annihilation, the probability of it happening just skyrockets.
And on top of that, these new cruise missiles have both nuclear and non-nuclear variants. So if a foe under attack detects a missile, they might have to assume the worst, a nuclear strike, and overreact, initiating nuclear war.
We're creating a hair trigger system.
That vastly increases the risk of global disaster purely in the name of strategic dominance and maintaining the military-industrial base.
Okay, moving to the second great threat, climate change. The data Chomsky reviews on the pace of environmental destruction is just deeply alarming.
The scientific consensus confirms that average temperatures are increasing at an astonishing rate. It's equivalent to moving south about 10 meters every single day.
Which is about 100 times faster than most climate change that we can observe in the geological record.
And some technical studies suggest it might be up to 1,000 times faster. Chomsky stresses that scarcely a day passes without some near ominous scientific discovery about this breakneck pace of destruction.
So if the richest, most technologically advanced societies have the capacity to address this, why are we, in his words, racing full speed ahead toward disaster?
Because the problem is fundamentally institutional. It stems from the economic structure of the masters of mankind. In market systems driven by that vile maxim, saving the environment is simply dismissed as an externality.
It doesn't contribute to the immediate balance sheet.
Right. And because businesses are basically required to maximize returns for shareholders, they have to prioritize short-term profit and market share.
Which makes environmental destruction close to an institutional imperative.
It does. If one company tries to internalize the costs of environmental protection, they'll be undercut by competitors who don't. The structure rewards those who exploit the environment most ruthlessly. And that leads to what we see in politics, where influential figures tied to fossil fuel interests actively dismantle environmental protections, even with overwhelming public concern.
Okay, so we've seen the symptoms of this elite control and policy, the Greek crisis, dangerous nuclear systems. Now let's try to reverse engineer the actual systems that generate these outcomes. Let's start with the economic architecture, the mechanics of the plutonomy.
Right. Chomsky analyzes this major economic shift that started around the 1970s, the transition away from regulated industrial capitalism toward financialization.
And this shift kicked off a cycle.
A self-reinforcing, vicious cycle of wealth concentration, primarily among the top fraction of 1%, CEOs, hedge fund managers, financial executives.
So concentrated wealth is accumulated, and then what's the next step in that cycle?
That concentrated wealth is immediately translated into political power. Wealth buys political influence, which then leads to state policies, deregulation, tax cuts, weak corporate governance, you name it, that further increase economic concentration.
And at the same time, the cost of elections skyrockets.
Which ensures that both major political parties become increasingly dependent on and therefore subservient to that concentrated financial capital.
And the risk created by this heavily leveraged system, it gets offloaded onto the public when it all inevitably fails. This is the nanny state for the financiers.
Indeed. Financial institutions benefit immensely from the implicit taxpayer subsidy we call too big to fail insurance.
And there are numbers on this.
There are. Bloomberg News, citing an IMF working paper, calculated this implicit subsidy for big banks is about $83 billion a year.
$83 billion annually.
And for many of these institutions, that figure virtually equals their entire annual profit. It's a massive, unlegislated transfer of wealth from taxpayers to financial institutions.
So this insurance guarantees they can take huge risks for huge rewards.
Knowing that when the system crashes, like it did in 2008 and many times before, they will run to the nanny state for a taxpayer bailout, while the architects of the crash walk away wealthy.
And this has been the regular structural process since the Reagan era.
It has. While the plutonomy thrives, the vast majority of the population sees stagnant real incomes, rising debt, and a degradation of social services. The failure is only for the non-rich.
Now, wealth concentration and imperial interventions, they need constant justification. That's where the narrative frameworks come in. Chomsky spends a lot of time dissecting the enduring power of the city on a hill myth.
This is the idea that the U.S. is inherently a benevolent actor with a transcendent purpose, uniquely charged with spreading peace, freedom, and democracy around the world.
And Chomsky systematically contrasts this romantic self-image with the historical reality.
He starts with the very first historical documents, like the original Massachusetts Bay Great Seal from 1630.
And what did that seal show?
It depicted an Indian pleading, "Come over and help us," which suggests this benevolent humanism, responding to native pleas for help. But Chomsky reminds us that the reality that followed was, in the words of the first U.S. Secretary of War, the utter extirpation of all the Indians in most populous parts of the Union.
This wasn't a gentle displacement. It was mass murder.
Utter devastation. John Quincy Adams later described the fate of the indigenous populations as resulting from merciless and perfidious cruelty and heinous sins.
So the city on a hill self-image is maintained by this profound national ideological effort to basically confound the historical record with an idealized national purpose.
To abuse reality, as Chomsky puts it.
Another key narrative is what he calls the grand illusion of security. We're constantly told that a government's primary mandate is the security of its population. He questions that.
His analysis suggests that government's core concerns are actually twofold. First, securing state power from the domestic population, and second, securing concentrated private power.
And you see this in the use of government secrecy.
Right. Archival studies show it's rarely motivated by a genuine need for national security. It serves to keep the population in the dark about the real drivers of policy and prevent democratic intervention.
It echoes that warning from political scientist Samuel Huntington that power remains strong only when it remains in the dark. Exposed to sunlight, it begins to evaporate.
And finally, we have to talk about who is included in the world when officials talk about international support. Chomsky analyzes that phrase, "terrorist wanted the world over."
And he explains that the world in Anglo-American political discourse often just means the political class in Washington and London and whoever happens to agree with them.
You see this so vividly in the global reaction to the bombing of Afghanistan after 9/11.
Right.
International Gallup polls at the time showed that global support for the bombing was marginal. We're talking 2 to 16% in Latin America. There was an overwhelming international preference for diplomatic or judicial measures.
But that preference was just rejected out of hand.
And the political class in Washington was still able to claim, without any contradiction in the domestic press, that the world supported their action. The narrative defines the world by those who consent to imperial actions.
And this system has built-in feedback loops that just reinforce its instability, continually concentrating power and wealth no matter what. The military-industrial complex loop is a classic example.
The defining moment for this loop was the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. In theory, that should have led to a massive demilitarization, a peace dividend.
But it didn't.
Not at all. Instead, the U.S. maintained its huge military establishment to confront the alleged technological sophistication of newly emerging third world powers, which was a transparent pretext.
The real driver, as internal documents revealed, was economic.
Absolutely. The new policy conceded that it was necessary to maintain the defense industrial base, and this is a crucial euphemism.
What does it really mean?
As Chomsky reveals, it's a euphemism for the advanced high-tech industry that is highly reliant on extensive government subsidy and initiative, often funneled through the Pentagon's budget under the cover of military spending.
So the state intervention, the massive funding for R&D, is hidden inside the military budget. That makes it politically palatable while it supports concentrated private power.
Yes. The military establishment provides the perfect conduit for massive taxpayer subsidies to advanced private industry, all within a system that is somehow still championed as a free market economy. It's a powerful feedback loop. State funding ensures corporate health, and corporate health demands a strong military to justify the continuing state funding.
And the final, and maybe most devastating feedback loop he analyzes is the jihadi response loop.
This explains how military intervention in the Middle East, particularly the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, plays directly into the strategic game plan of transnational jihadi movements like al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Their goal isn't to win on the battlefield.
No, their goal is to perpetually engage and enervate the United States and the West. They use asymmetrical warfare to lure the West into these costly, protracted conflicts.
So they want the West to spend enormous resources in a way that generates more local resentment and, as a result, more recruits for their cause.
That's the mechanism. One researcher, Scott Atran, calculated the cost-to-effect ratio. The 9/11 attacks cost between $400,000 and $500,000 to execute. The military and security response by the U.S. and its allies has been in the order of 10 million times that figure.
Wow.
Chomsky notes that on a strict cost-benefit analysis, the violent movement has been wildly successful beyond even bin Laden's original imagination. By continuing to wield the sledgehammer of military force, the West tacitly follows the jihadi script, and the result is escalating violence and a broader appeal for jihadism. So if we accept that this systemic logic is one of unilateral imperial control, we can better understand current global conflicts. Chomsky uses the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world was on the brink of nuclear annihilation, as a model for current policy toward rivals like Iran.
The key takeaway from that crisis, which is often left out of the history books, is the principle that U.S. planners upheld. The U.S. has the unilateral, unchallenged right to deploy nuclear missiles aimed at others, but others, like Cuba or the Soviet Union, should have absolutely no right to possess a deterrent against U.S. force.
President Kennedy specifically rejected fair trades with Khrushchev that could have de-escalated the crisis, like removing obsolete U.S. missiles from Turkey just to uphold this principle.
Exactly. And this very principle, this rejection of the right to deterrence, is the primary official charge against Iran today. The concern isn't necessarily that Iran is actively building a bomb.
It's the possibility that it might achieve a capacity to pose a deterrent.
Right. The mere possibility of a credible deterrent to U.S. and Israeli force is intolerable to the imperial doctrine of unilateral control. And this principle of unilateralism, this idea that we can deploy forces wherever we want, but others can't defend their own borders, also underlies the Ukraine crisis and NATO expansion.
The crisis really traces back to the post-Cold War expansion of NATO right up to Russia's borders. And this was in violation of verbal pledges given to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east.
And Russia and much of the global south sees this steady encroachment as profoundly threatening.
Of course, it establishes strategic primacy for the U.S. and its allies right near its vital borders, but the U.S. defines its actions and control over the region as purely defensive.
That's the crucial political definition.
The United States regards its policy of controlling the seas off China's coasts as defensive, while China sees it as a threat. Conversely, China regards its own buildup as defensive, while the U.S. calls it threatening. This security dilemma only makes sense if you accept the unstated assumption that the U.S. has a legitimate right to absolute global control, and any challenge to that is inherently an aggressive act.
So it's not surprising, then, that this behavior has led to a major shift in how the U.S. is perceived around the world.
No, not at all. Prominent political analysts writing in establishment journals, people like Samuel Huntington and Robert Jervis, have noted this fundamental change. They cite global polls showing that for much of the world, the U.S. is now seen as becoming the rogue superpower, the single greatest external threat to their societies, and the prime rogue state today.
And that perception comes directly from its unilateral use of force, its exemption from treaties it imposes on others,
and its persistent adherence to this imperial doctrine.
Okay, returning to the domestic front, this structure of power drives an active environmental regression, especially within the political system.
Yes, and we see the dismantling of limited environmental protections, even ones initiated by a conservative president like Nixon, most clearly exemplified by congressional Republicans. This behavior is driven by the power of big energy and business lobbies.
And these groups have funded decades of propaganda campaigns to confuse the public about global warming,
which has had a measurable and devastating impact on public policy. And it creates this huge gap between what the public wants and what policy actually delivers on climate action.
And the contrast with the global south is striking.
It is. Chomsky highlights that the strongest stands against global warming are often taken not by the rich industrialized powers, but by indigenous communities and the states they govern.
He mentions Bolivia, for instance.
Bolivia, which has a strong indigenous majority, has constitutional requirements protecting the rights of nature. Ecuador, which is an oil exporter, is one of the only nations known to actively seek aid to keep its oil in the ground.
Which is the direct opposite of what rich, powerful states are doing.
The contrast could not be clearer. While Bolivia and Ecuador seek to preserve nature, Chomsky observes that the U.S. and Canada are racing full speed ahead to extract every last drop of hydrocarbons as quickly as possible. This is that institutional imperative of short-term profit maximization overriding any potential for long-term survival.
So the ultimate consequence of this predatory obsession with fossil fuels is that we are courting global disaster.
Yes. The reliance on fossil fuels driven by these elite obsessions courts global disaster. And Chomsky emphasizes that the longer we delay addressing this, the more awful the legacy we leave to future generations will be. The prospects for decent long-term survival are profoundly threatened unless there's a dramatic change, of course.
A change that breaks the power of the corporate institutions designed to accelerate this destruction.
Exactly.
And if the masters of mankind control policy, they also have to ensure the public can intervene. One of the most effective tools for this is the erosion of democratic accountability, which is especially visible in the structure of modern trade agreements.
Right. Agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, are routinely mislabeled as free trade agreements.
Chomsky argues they're not about trade in the traditional sense. They're complex investor rights agreements.
And they're negotiated in secret.
Almost total secrecy, almost exclusively by corporate lawyers and lobbyists, not by elected officials. So how does the procedure itself block democracy?
Well, their fundamental purpose is to impose these investor rights regimes, which further concentrate power in the hands of global capital and supersede national sovereignty. And the agreements are intended to be adopted in what Chomsky calls a Stalinist style via fast-track procedures.
And fast track is specifically designed to block discussion.
It blocks debate, it blocks amendment by elected representatives, it allows only a simple yes or no vote, and that ensures the will of the corporate architects is imposed without any meaningful democratic input.
Beyond trade, he connects modern government practices to these foundational, centuries-old liberties, like the Magna Carta.
He argues that modern practices like rendition, which is imprisonment abroad for the purpose of torture, represent a profound offense against liberties established centuries ago. The Magna Carta set crucial limits on state authority.
And the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679 specifically barred imprisonment beyond the seas.
Exactly, to prevent torture and extrajudicial detention. So when a modern state claims the right to imprison a person anywhere, indefinitely, and outside the rule of law, it's violating rights that Western civilization established hundreds of years ago.
And the very idea that the state should have this unchecked unilateral authority
Represents a serious offense against liberties. The fact that this practice has become somewhat uncontentious in mainstream political discourse suggests a deep systemic decline in the protection of foundational rights against state power.
This all seems to circle back to the core theme, power operating entirely beyond public control, where the public is assigned the role of spectators.
Right. In liberal democratic theory, that's the role. The entire system relies on the general population remaining passive, apathetic, and diverted to consumerism or hatred of the vulnerable.
This marginalization is critical for the powerful to act as they please.
Unconstrained by popular will or electoral cycles. The population's role is to consent, not to govern.
And central to this is maintaining the illusion that we live in a free market economy. Chomsky challenges this by revealing the hidden hand of state intervention.
We're constantly told the market is sovereign. But the most advanced, profitable sector, the high-tech industry, that defense industrial base we talked about, relies heavily on extensive state intervention for R&D, funneled through the Pentagon.
It shows this profound, concealed involvement of the state in supporting concentrated private power.
The profits are privatized, the risks and the costs of innovation are socialized through the taxpayer.
Which explains why, to the average person, the economy feels rigged. The policies that lead to stagnant wages and rising debt are often framed as an economic failure.
But Chomsky argues we should understand them instead as failure by design. These outcomes are not bugs in the system, they're features. They're highly successful for the designers, that tiny fraction at the upper extreme of the plutonomy, the masters of mankind.
The failure is not economic, it's explicitly class-based.
Exactly. It results from policies intended to maximize elite wealth and power at the expense of the underlying population.
Let's delve a bit deeper into how moral narratives, often framed around these high humanitarian ideals, mask structural violence and imperial aims.
The doctrine of humanitarian intervention, often known today as the responsibility to protect, or R2P, is viewed by the Global South as, well, nothing more than the old right of imperial domination, just dressed up in new, morally acceptable clothing.
They see it as a selective tool used to justify atrocities that serve elite interests.
A prime example being the US-UK invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Right.
That invasion, launched with no credible pretext, no UN authorization, led to hundreds of thousands killed, millions of refugees, and it ignited sectarian conflict that directly laid the basis for the rise of ISIS.
And yet, in informed Western circles, it can still be blandly called the liberation of Iraq.
Which demonstrates the immense power of that narrative framework to sanitize atrocities that serve the imperial doctrine.
And this brings us back to the outrage calculus, the reserved moral response only for the crimes of others.
Compare the outrage over the downing of Flight 17 in Ukraine, a crime universally called an outrage of unspeakable proportions, with comparable crimes by the U.S. or its allies. We already mentioned the U.S. missile attack on the El Shifa plant in Sudan.
Which likely caused tens of thousands of deaths.
But because the victims were considered unpeople and the U.S. didn't have the specific intent to kill a particular person, the incident is just dismissed.
It creates a hierarchy of suffering based purely on the identity of the perpetrator and the victim's utility to the system.
Yes, outrage is reserved for the crimes of enemies, regardless of their scale. Meanwhile, vastly more severe structural violence committed by the masters of mankind, policies that lead to mass death through poverty, sanctions, or destroying essential infrastructure, is rationalized as accidental or collateral damage. The system is structurally designed to disregard those victims as unworthy of moral consideration.
So ultimately, Chomsky seems to suggest that the persistence of these systems hinges on whether the underlying populations can successfully overcome these barriers and impose accountability.
He draws on Thorstein Veblen's critique, referring to the underlying populations who must hope to overcome the power of business and nationalist doctrine to become alive and fit to live. This necessity for mass popular action to reform an elite-dominated system is really the ultimate test of any society that claims to be democratic.
And if the underlying populations fail to overcome that power, then we just continue to see these outcomes that, while disastrous for the majority, are incredibly successful for the elite.
That is the ultimate tension. The systems we've mapped are designed with institutional imperatives that consistently subordinate the needs of the species, long-term survival, climate stability, peace to the immediate short-term needs of concentrated capital.
So the gap between democratic ideals and political outcomes isn't a symptom of government clumsiness.
No, it's a feature of a highly successful class-based system.
This deep dive into who rules the world provides a pretty stark lens for analyzing the modern global system. Chomsky really forces us to look past the superficial political narratives and focus instead on these deep-seated institutional imperatives.
Profit maximization, imperial control, elite self-interest. These are the things that dictate global outcomes and determine the menu of political choices.
And it feels crucial to internalize this perspective now because, as he meticulously documents, the systems themselves are actively accelerating the two gravest dangers facing humanity:
Nuclear war and environmental destruction. The prevailing economic structure is fundamentally designed to ignore these known externalities that threaten the decent survival of the species. It prioritizes short-term gain above all else, even when the clock is clearly ticking.
Chomsky paints a very stark picture, emphasizing that there is not much time. The question really remains for us, for the listeners and the citizens: can the underlying populations successfully reform this dysfunctional political system? Can they impose accountability, constraining the actions of their own powerful states, before these structural incentives lead us past the point of no return?
And the ultimate reflection is on the privilege and opportunity that's afforded to citizens in these powerful states. Chomsky concludes that those of us who enjoy this privilege have a responsibility to use it effectively to mitigate the greatest risks, realizing that the survival of the species might very well depend on successfully overcoming the power of the masters of mankind.
We have been exploring the institutional dynamics of global power as critiqued by Noam Chomsky, the author of Who Rules the World.
If you found these ideas valuable, we really encourage you to read the book yourself.
Support the author or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
And if you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.